Rachel Baumberger. I'm here today with Stanley Porter, who is the author of not one, but 3 new or forthcoming books from Eerdmans. Welcome, Stanley.
Thank you, Rachel. Good to be with you.
Well, the first book, the one that just recently came out, 2 of them have just recently come out. Well done.
Thank you.
Is called John, His Gospel, and Jesus in Pursuit of the Johannine Voice. Why did you, the subtitle I think is particularly interesting to me. You went off on a quest. What were you looking for in writing this book?
Well, actually coming up with the title was probably the most difficult thing about the book. And I worked on it quite a bit, and my wife worked on it quite a bit. I was struggling with that because what I was trying to do in the book was to bring John's Gospel sort of into play with a lot of other things that are going on in Gospels research. And so there's a chapter, for example, about John as proclamation, John's relationship to other later Gospels to which it is sometimes compared, and how it relates to the Synoptic Gospels. So there are a lot of things trying to tie it in with a movement that's taking place. I think it's a very welcome movement that is looking at John's Gospel, not marginalizing it and thinking, well, we have the Synoptics and then John's Gospel is something different. No, let's bring John's Gospel into conversation here with the other Gospels. So that's really where the main title comes from, right? John, his Gospel, but also because the Gospel is about Jesus. On the other hand, I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that this is a book about John's Gospel. And there are some unique things about John's Gospel, some themes that John treats, some ways that John treats various subjects, including how John represents Jesus, that are worth looking at in their own right.
So do we sometimes in looking at John's Gospel get so bogged down in the person of John or the community around the book that we lose sight of Jesus, the subject of the book?
Yeah, that's a good question because you're obviously hinting at some of the Johannine scholarship through the years, such as the community hypothesis. And I think the community hypothesis has tended to result in a marginalization of John's Gospel, or treating John's Gospel as the theological gospel, as if it has nothing to say about historical matters, such as who Jesus was, what viewpoint might be relevant to Jesus, who he was and what he did and what he said, and whether John's Gospel can have something to contribute to that. And so, yes, it does address some of those issues. It does not spend a lot of time with the community hypothesis, but I do call it into question.
Right.
Because I see John's Gospel and all the Gospels having not necessarily written for everybody, but some kind of a wider dissemination than just functioning within a given community.
So you went in pursuit of the voice. Did you find the voice?
I guess my readers will have to determine whether I found the voice. I found what I think is a voice, at least a voice on certain issues. And so, I treat things that are sort of special or unique to John's Gospel. I have a treatment of, for example, how the phrasing of the Jews are used in John's Gospel. Very controversial, is John's Gospel anti-Semitic or what does that mean? And I take a particular view on that. I don't think that it's anti-Semitic. I think there's a much more nuanced view of this language that takes place in John's Gospel. And so that would be part of that Johannine voice. Deal with an issue like truth in John's Gospel, a theme or motif that is developed by John's Gospel in particular ways. The idea of the Passover idea and what John does with that. So there are a number of things like this that are sort of, I guess, Johannine voice things.
Your other book that's out this fall is a different book with a different purpose, Fundamentals of New Testament Textual Criticism, which you wrote with Andrew Pitts?
Andrew Pitts, yes.
Andrew Pitts. And this book has been a long time in the making. What were you two hoping to accomplish with it, and what are you offering readers through it?
Well, this book is part of a series that I'm doing with Eerdmans around Greek language things. And so we have our Fundamentals of New Testament Greek book and workbook that are already out and being used.
Books.
Yes. And this is the, I guess, second or third, depending on how you count the workbook in relationship to the grammar, installment in that program. And so what we're thinking is that students are introduced to Greek language through the basic books, but then as they develop, they want to find out more about the text of the Greek New Testament. So this book addresses that. And what we try to do then is provide an introduction to textual criticism for students of Greek, and we are hoping, and God willing, this is what we're working on, is to have an intermediate level grammar that will then be a logical movement from the first year to this intermediate level. Probably the fundamentals of New Testament textual criticism would be used possibly in a first year, but more likely in a second year Greek class. And then we have projected an introduction to biblical interpretation. So it fits within this sort of whole scheme of things. If things work out the way we're planning, we'll get those done as soon as we can. But this is the textual criticism part of it. And so we do several things in there that not just introduce, the kinds of manuscripts and what do you get when you open up a critical text, but some things on canon, some things on translations, all sorts of things to help students come to terms with the text of the New Testament.
And in what ways have you consciously tried to shape this book to make it as useful as possible for the classroom?
Well, we try to do a number of different things. One is we try to identify particular terms when they're introduced, and we highlight those in a way that students can recognize them as terms that are important, terms are being introduced to for the first time. Take note of these. We then have a list of these kinds of terms at the end of the chapter so that they can kind of test themselves, if you will. They can go through the list and say, do I remember who this person is or what this concept is? And ideally they'd say, yeah, I understand this, and they can move on to the next thing. If they don't, well, they can go back and then they can find it easily enough in the text, go from there. And we also have bibliographies, short bibliographies of key works that we have used in the writing of the chapter or that we think are important for this topic and that students might find useful. The chapters are all fairly short, broken down into sort of manageable units that could be scheduled throughout a term. And then I guess probably also we've organized it in such a way that it has a kind of a logic and flow. So they are introduced to some of the basic things first, and then it leads up to the use of the Greek Testament itself. And then we have some photographs and some other things to of pages, sample pages, to show students how to use the text.
Sounds like a very useful tool.
We hope it'll be widely used. I think it'll help a lot because it does some things other textbooks don't do, and it's kind of pitched, I think, at a level that's not like your major works, text critical works for scholars, but it's not just a very, very, very basic introduction for somebody who has no knowledge of the language.
Now, before we close, oftentimes when I get close to the end of a conversation, I will ask, what's next for an author? And usually I have no idea. But in this case, I do know. You have another book coming out with us in the spring, The Apostle Paul, His Life and Letters. What's that one about?
Yes, well, it's an introduction to Paul, and it basically is concerned with, I think the subtitle is The Life, Letters, and Theology, or Life, Theology, and Letters of Paul, or something like that. And so it tries to cover all three of those dimensions. So we talk about Paul as a human being.
Yes.
I talk about it. I wrote that with myself, but with some help of some of my graduate assistants. It tells the life of Paul. It deals then with his major sort of thoughts and ideas, and then has an introduction to each of the letters, and trying to catch people up with the major critical issues and what kinds of things they should know, not just about the content of the letter, though those are very, very important issues to know the content, what is being said, but authorship kinds of things, questions of whether letters are made up of multiple letters, all sorts of kinds of critical questions.
We often, when we think of Paul, we think of him, in terms of his ideas, or we think of him in terms of one letter, or. But to take this sort of broad approach to looking at Paul the person, how often do we forget to think about Paul the person? And then each of the letters, it's a really useful approach, I think. Yeah,
Rich, I think that's a really important observation. These letters, and I happen to take all 13 letters attributed to Paul as authentic, and I defend that in the book. But yeah, this was a real human being who lived at a real point in time in a real place, And he wrote these letters out of various circumstances that he knew about, things that were happening in the churches, most of which he perhaps had visited, some of which he had not, some he looked forward to visiting, wrote to some of the people that he worked with, like Timothy, Titus, things like this. He was a real human, and so he was concerned for various issues. And so I try to get at the sense that Paul isn't reducible to just one book. Romans is often that book for Paul. And it's a marvelous book. There's no doubt about it. Romans is fantastic, and I spend time with it in the book. But he wrote a lot of other letters, and even a little small letter like Philemon, But what a wonderful letter it is, a tremendous letter, lots that we can learn from it. So I try to kind of fit this all together and see it coming out of, embedded in a circumstance, but also reflecting the great genius of this person, Paul.
Mm-hmm. Well, Paul is not reducible to just one work, and neither are you. So thank you for coming and talking with us about all three of your books.
Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Rachel.
All right. The books, again, are John, His Gospel and Jesus, Fundamentals of New Testament Textual Criticism, and The Apostle Paul.